Hello and welcome to the Warhammer YouTube channel. Today we'll be talking about Warcry, the new skirmish combat game set in the Age of Sigmar universe, and we'll be specifically talking about the Daughters of Khaine faction. We'll be using some math to examine the different leader and troop choices and help you come up with some starting lists. So let's look at the data. Before I actually show you the spreadsheet with the different cell values and things that I've come up with, you will see a lot of color-coded information in the spreadsheet. For most of that data, this is the key for how I've derived the color value. So it's not just arbitrary. Some of the things that are arbitrary I will point out, but most of it is how that value in a cell compares to the rest of the game. So things that are yellow and green are pretty much right in the center of the bell curve, and the more blue you get, the better it's performing compared to the rest of the game, and the more red you get, the worse that value is compared to the entire rest of the game. So let's move into it. So I will start with kind of an overall discussion of the faction, or at least some opinions. I'll try to let you know when I have a subjective opinion versus something that's informed by data. And so my thoughts on the faction as a whole and how it breaks down. There's a lot of choices in this faction. I think there is there's 6 leaders and 8 troop choices. That's a lot. I believe that's the most in the game. So there's a lot of things to choose from, but it actually breaks down to be not terribly complicated. So really, you just have a couple different variations of the same things. So with our leader choices, the fundamental decisions we have to make between our leaders are going to match the fundamental decisions we have to make about our troops. So there's a lot less decision making here than it seems at first go. So we have 3 main styles of leader. We have these Khaine, which are very fast moving at move 12, and they also fly. You have the Blood Sisters and the Blood Stalkers. I believe these are all made from the same kit, just like the Khaine. I apologize if I'm pronouncing Khaine wrong. I don't play this faction normally, and I don't recall anybody actually saying the word to me in person, so I'm just having to shoot from the hip on that one. The Khaine are very fast moving with fly. You have the Blood Sister and Blood Stalker, which are still pretty fast moving, and this is a subjectively color-coded column. This is not the actual average move in the game is just over 5. Yeah, but I've color-coded things that are 5 to be green, 4 to be yellow, and 3 and under to be orange and red in my movement column, and anything above like 8 to be in the darker blue range. So 7 is a very good move value in this game, though. You're going to be noticeably faster than a lot of other things, but you're not anywhere near as fast as these Khaine, which are 12 move with fly. So 7 move without fly, absolutely you're going to get lapped by these Khaine, but it's still pretty good. And then there's the slowest option, which is also much cheaper, and that's the move 5, no fly. There's 2 options there, the Sister of Slaughter Handmaiden and the Witch Elf Hag. So these are noticeably cheaper and less elite than the Blood variants and the Khaine variants. So, okay. So I think if you watched my best and worst of video, you're aware that I threw some shade at one of the Khaine troops. That was, I think, the only time they got mentioned in this game in that video. But I was specifically talking about the troop choice, not the leader choice. I think the leader choices for these aren't quite as bad. They're still a little bit problematic, but the extra points you pay to go up to the full leader version of the Khaine, you seem to get a better value for what you're paying points wise. So I'm not as against the Khaine as leader choices as I am for troop choices. So just cutting off at the pass if you came here to see me throw more hate at the Khaine. Okay. So the Khaine and the Blood variants, they're in the similar point values, the 245 and 235. So, and there's they each have 2 different versions, and these really just vary on their weapon choice. So the top line Khaine is a range 8, and the second one down is a range 1. And the Blood Sisters have a range 2 spear versus an incredible range 20. So 3 to 20 is, I believe, the best range in the game. The Stormcast have a range 6 through 20, but that, having the minimum side of the range be 3 is a pretty big deal, and there's nothing that's going to outclass it in terms of range. So it's really, really great range. Just total effective amount of board that you can hit with this Bloodstalker Crone is the best in the game. Okay. And so let me just talk about these elite choices first, and then I'll come down here and discuss the Sister of Slaughter and the Witch Elf Hag. Okay. So scrolling over, you can see you have more wounds on the Blood Sisters and Stalkers than the Khaine. So that's 1 point in favor of the Blood variants. We're going to have a rune ability, and I will pop over to the runes here in a second and examine the differences. They all have leader, obviously. The Khaine have fly. They take the agile rune, whereas you have to make a choice here between the Blood Sister and the Stalker. And one gets an elite rune, the other one gets a berserker rune, and there's an ability for each of those. So, actually, I will talk about those abilities when we get to the troop section, so not yet. And as you see already, the dark red starts showing up here with the Khaine. So you're starting to pay a heavy tax for that incredible move 12 with fly. And the blood variant is it's still on the lower side of average, but it's still a perfectly reasonable price to pay for a boss. Bosses in a lot of other factions are more expensive. Here you seem to get a better deal with the boss than you do with the troops. So, and because of I think these are toughness 4, so you don't get, those 20 wounds versus the 30 here, that the difference in them kind of stays roughly the same. And you're getting a much better value. So what I have here, in case this is your first video of mine that you've seen, let me just try to maximize the screen with this, is simulating how many average attacks from a strength 2 opponent it's going to take to kill this model, and the same how many average attacks from a strength 3, strength 4, strength 5. And this is based on, when I say average attacks, this is based on the average base damage in the game, which is like 1.59, I think, and the average critical damage in the game, which is like 4.03, I believe it was. So based on those average base and critical values, how many attacks from a strength 2 opponent on average would be required to kill this model. So that's going to factor in the number of wounds and the toughness against these various sources of strength. And based on what the distribution of those strength values are in the game, I come up with the average attacks to kill. So there's a lot more strength 3 and 4 in the game than there is strength 5 and strength 2 and whatnot. So if you weight all those appropriately, it's going to come out with an average of 17.92 attacks to kill Khaine, and almost 27 attacks to kill a Blood Sister or Blood Stalker. So then just take the number of points in the model and then divide by that number of attacks to kill, and you get the points per attacks to kill. And this is a way of kind of getting a sense of the overall durability and the price per overall durability. Okay. And through the similar kind of methodology with the durability, the actual offensive output, I've calculated here. So you see the damage against toughness 2, toughness 3, and toughness 4 and 5 enemies. So based on the actual attack profile of this character, of this fighter, how does that perform against the various toughness values? And this is going to be based on the strength of that attack and like its base damage and its critical damage. And you can see if you weight with all of the different toughness values in the game according to how represented they are overall, you get an average damage output of this character of 4.09, which is slightly above average. The Khaine Life Taker has a things in this light blue are things that I would expect of elite models, certainly at close range, and this is that 1-inch range versus the 8-inch range. So this is comfortably elite levels of damage output, but this is a highly elite price. Was this 235 points? So he actually comes out not too great in the points per effective damage category, but not as bad as the Khaine Heartrender, which is some of the worst points per effective damage in the game. But as we'll see in a minute, it's not nearly as bad as the troop variant of this. But being able to hit with this much damage from 8 inches away after making a 12-inch flying move is pretty interesting, because this is a good strong attack. It's not as strong as this, but this from 8 inches away is a problem that needs to be dealt with on the board. All right, as you can see here, we have our first really dark blue of the I think in the only dark blue cell in this entire faction spreadsheet. This is a very good effective damage value. And this Blood Sister, this is a range, hold on, I forgot. This is a range 2 attack. So this is really, really good for a range 2. So range 2 attack doing average damage of 8.18, and the points per effective damage is actually really good for this model. So this is a good deal for the damage that you get. There's only a couple of models out there that are doing more damage per activation than this, or should say per attack action. And so his effective damage is really good priced, and as you can see, his points per wound, points per attacks to kill, his durability, his points per durability is also really good. Since I've talked about these columns here, let me just save some space on our spreadsheet and hide these columns, make it easier, a little bit easier to follow. I'm going to hide our damage breakouts as well. Okay, so the Bloodstalker Crone has the exact same durability and yeah, it's the same toughness 4, 30 wounds, but it is this really extreme range, 30 through 20, or I'm sorry, 3 through 20. Pretty nice attack. So it works out a little bit. It looks a little bit better in the points per effective attack, just because he's a 10 points cheaper model, but it's really very similar. It looks a lot worse when you look at this effective damage 3.79 as compared to the 10 point more expensive 2-inch range version that does 8.18. But at 20 inches, this is crazy. You have to remember the Stormcast Eternal, their long shot boss, which has a minimum of 6 and a maximum of 20, he does less damage than this. Of the units that do the longest range, this is the one that does the most damage at that range. So this is actually a pretty nice weapon to have if you choose to bring it. You are paying a hefty price for it, but this is something that needs to be dealt with by your opponent. Okay. And he has a backup melee option, but as you can see at 1.1, this is just an absolute worst case scenario. If there's literally nothing, you don't have the ability to disengage, you can't move anywhere, and you just really want to tickle somebody up close, go for it, but it just really try to avoid melee at all costs if you're taking the Crone. Okay. I will say one thing that differs a little bit on the I could see a case being made for the Stormcast super long range option being better if you plan to use Onslaught continuously. So this one, it gets a better effective damage output because it has more attacks. The Stormcast version has this crazy, I think it's critical 10, but it's only one attack, so its average is lower, but if you use Onslaught with that character, now it effectively doubles its offensive output, and it's crazy. So this doesn't scale quite as harshly with Onslaught, so that should be, if you're new to this, Onslaught is the ability, it's a universal ability that adds 1 to the attack profile. So whenever I examine the different abilities in the troop options, I'm going to be comparing a lot of things to Onslaught, because Onslaught, since it's universal and it's a pretty good ability, things, particularly abilities that are doubles, they need to kind of justify their existence on, is this worth not spending this double on an Onslaught? Because a lot of abilities underperform against Onslaught. It's going to be hard for me to recommend Khaine, but of the The leaders, I'll put a little bit more recommendation behind them than the troops, but I definitely do like these Blood Sister and Blood Stalker, and I will give list options that take either one of these. The slower, cheaper options. I think one good thing about this faction is that they give you actually have a very wide variety here of leader point values, so you can really make choices on how to invest points you want to put into your leaders versus your regular troops. So you have the super elite leader options that are all the really expensive ones we just talked about, and then you have two different levels here. You have a kind of a pretty cost-effective one in the Sister of Slaughter at 150, and then a very cheap leader at 115 points in the Witch Elf Hag. So 115 points puts him at one of the cheaper bosses out there, so pretty nice. So let's examine those two. So you were paying, he's got 1 extra toughness. They have the same number of wounds. He has 1 extra toughness. You get an extra inch of reach. And he does... So he ends up doing a little bit more damage. Not sure. You're going to have to make that call if that's worth it to you or not. The extra, what is that? 0.8 damage and an extra 1 inch of range. If that's worth 35 points to you. So that's there's some other choices down there later where there's a unit that's a little bit more expensive where you get similar gains. So I think in those choices where the point values are closer, it's an easy thing to spend on that upgrade. But here, the 35 points, this is it's a little bit tricky of an upgrade. But if you built a list with the Witch Elf Hag and you had 35 points left over, no problem. I would upgrade it to the Sister of Slaughter. Okay. But these are just very boring options. I think the Sister of Slaughter, Witch Elf Hag, they're not great. Really, you don't get. They're not a bargain. I think they don't do great amounts of damage, and I think the Witch Elf Hag maybe is a little bit safer. There's only 2 units in the game here that are. The 2 units in this faction that are not significantly below average, and by significantly I mean in the orange or below, that are not. There's only 2 units in this faction that are not significantly below average in any of their categories. Points efficiency. So points efficiency for the damage output, this leader is only slightly below average, and points efficiency for his durability, he's only slightly below average. And there's so usually there's a trade-off. So you can see all these other, the Blood Sisters, a good buy there too. But yeah, so usually there's a trade-off. You're paying, you'll get a good value for your damage output, but then, you'll suffer on the back end on the durability here. In general, this whole faction is pretty low durability and pretty low damage output, but pretty good on movement. So it's going to be a very tricky faction to play as a whole, I think. So if you are doing well and winning lots of games and tournaments with this faction, I think you've earned it. Certainly, it's a little bit different than Sigmar, where a lot of people might be drawn to the faction because they're looking for something they can maybe take and have a bit more of a known quantity to win a lot of games with. This is if you're out there and you're playing Warcry with this faction, I think you might be doing it out of true love for the Daughters of Khaine army and lore and all that, because this is not going to be an easy day at the park from a gameplay perspective. All right, so let's moving on to the troops, and we see we have very similar choices to make to the leaders. We have 2 options of Khaine. We have 2 options of Blood Sister and Stalker. We have 2 options of Sister of Slaughter, and 2 options of Witch Elves. And so the Khaine are the fast flying, then you have a medium fast not flying, and then you have a not slow set. So those are our fundamental choices. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Khaine first, and if you saw my best and worst of videos, you might be prepared for this. So pretty expensive, firmly elite, both of these, 175, 165, only 10 wounds, so that should be, I mean, there's some chaff in this game that's basically 10 wounds, so should be a little bit surprising. All right, let's move over. Okay, so the Khinnerai have the Agile rune as well as the leaders of that. These Blood Sisters have Elite, Bloodstalkers have Berserker. I think right now I'm going to switch over and talk about the abilities so we can keep that in mind as we look at some of these really staggeringly questionable numbers here. All right, onto the abilities tab. Okay, so I'm going to start out, since I'm talking about the Khinnerai first, I'm going to scroll down and talk about their special ability, which is Death on the Wind. So it's just a slightly upgraded version of Rampage. Everybody gets Rampage. It's universal. The added bonus to this version of Rampage is you can add one to the strength characteristic as long as they finish the bonus move within 6 inches or more of their starting position. So a slightly upgraded quad ability. It's honestly, it's not one of those game-breaking quads. It doesn't seem like this is a subjective analysis of this quad ability, but there's some of these quads that you look at and you're like, oh man, that really changes the game. This, as I've stated before, I don't think, and I did a whole video on strength and toughness and how important they are to the game, and they are not. I think they are not as important as the game designers had hoped they would be, and I had some kind of direct proofs of that. So as you can see, that if this is an upgraded version of Rampage that all it does is modify the strength characteristic, I suspect this might not be as powerful as an ability as they had perhaps intended it to be. So all right, so strike against the Khinnerai, in that I don't think their agile ability here, this Death on the Wind, is particularly noteworthy, but it is. If you rolled a quad and you wanted to use it, it's just strictly a better version of Rampage. There's no reason to use Rampage if you can use Death on the Wind. Okay, so now let's look at the Elite and the Berserker runes for when we compare the Blood Sisters and the Bloodstalker. So turn to Crystal, pick an enemy fighter within 12, roll 2 dice. For each 4 to 5, allocate 1 point of damage. For each 6, you allocate the number of points of that ability. So if you had a double 4, then rolling a 6 would allocate 4 points of damage. So how effective this double is going to depend on what the actual value of the dice. So you can make a choice on, it's like, I only want to use this ability on 4, 5s, or 6s, or I only want to use this on 5s and 6s, and you're going to get a better return on your investment if you use this on higher and higher dice only. But so we're going to have to compare mathematically to see, does this ability, for the fighters that are eligible to use it, does this ability outperform Onslaught? Because Onslaught is another double. It's the universal double that adds 1 to the attacks. So if that ability, the special ability, does not outperform Onslaught, then it's not a good idea to use the special ability. And the Berserker is going to get Heart Seekers. So it's a bit situational, but it's pretty cool. If the next attack action made by this activation, by the fighter, this activation scores 1 or more critical hits, then you can, and the target fighter is more than 3 inches away, so it has to be a ranged attack. Allocate a number of damage points to that fighter, to the value of this ability. So this is another one. Depending on how you choose to play this ability, you're going to get more return for your dice out of it. So let's hop back over. And all right, so comparing these Khinnerai, as I mentioned, I'm not a huge fan of this Agile rune. It's strictly better than nothing, but it's not as potent as I think other factions' quads, and it's certainly nowhere near the best quad abilities in the game. It's I would I don't have a way. It's hard for me to quantify what are the best and worst, because a lot of these abilities are like area of effect type abilities and things like that. And this is yeah, it's just hard to rack and stack these. But my subjective opinion is that this is on the bottom tier of quad abilities in the game. Okay, so the Khaine are. So they're bad, and they're just straight up points per wound. Some of the worst in the game. I think maybe the worst in the game. I can't remember. If you watch my best and worst video, I spelled it out explicitly in there. I believe it might be the worst in the game. And the points per average attacks to kill, you can see this is so just under 9 average attacks to kill. At this number of points, this is just a terrible, atrocious value. And the amount of damage he's doing is 2.03. So there's chaff in the game doing better damage output than this. This is lower damage than I would expect for anything even in the line infantry tier of fighters. So for the points you're paying for that is just off the charts, crazy. But this is the 8-inch version of that weapon. So you're able to move 12 inches, and you're able to strike from 8 inches away. But my question that I posed in the best and worst video is, how useful is it striking from 8 inches away if you're only doing 2 effective damage per attack? So yes, it's nice to strike from that far away, but if you're not actually able to kill models or really move their to pile up wounds on them at all, how useful is it? Now, this would be a different story if this was a cheap model and you could get a few of these guys on the table hitting from that far away because they could gang up on something. But it turns out this is not a cheap model. This is a very expensive model, 175 points. So doing 2 damage per attack for 175 points, it's just crazy. Crazy town. So, but if you're a big fan of that range, you like moving 12 and being able to strike from 8, because that gives you kind of I would use the term like threat radius. So how far, if you start your attack, if you activate a fighter 1 turn, what's the range of other fighters that you could attack that same turn? So you would need, 1 turn of movement and then an attack or something like that. So this Khaine Heartrender would have an effective threat radius of 20, because it's the 12 base move, and then he can hit something 8 inches away. So he can do his 1 move and his attack, and then the next action he could attack something from 8 inches away. So he could hit something that was 20 inches away at the start of his turn. So if you like being able to hit, if threat radius is important to you, I think there's a better choice in this same faction for that, and we'll get to that in a second. So I'm just trying to keep adding to the conversation here about the Khaine and my distrust of them. All right, so the Life Taker is a little bit not quite as bad looking from a stats perspective here. So he's got the 1-inch range versus 8, but and his durability is similarly terrible and expensive. But he does a little bit more. He's still below average, which should be shocking for a 1-inch range weapon from an elite model, but it is what it is. But you can think for yourself if that 7 inches of range is worth doing almost half the amount of damage. So instead of comparing these to other models in this faction and other elites in the game, I think the closest facsimile to these Khaine would be, I like comparing them to the Ether Wings from the Stormcast Eternals, because they actually, despite their massive point discrepancy, they actually aren't that far off in terms of their movement, their flying characteristic, and their durability and damage output. So that should be very telling. So, for example, the Khaine Heartrender, he is roughly twice the durability of the Ether Wing, despite having the same movement and flying, and he does only 0.5 points per damage more per attack than the Aetherwing, and he is 3.8 times the price. And the Life Taker has the same range of attack, 1 inch, has the same movement, 12 inches, has the same flying characteristic. He has the Agile rune, but as I said, it's not that big of a deal. You could use the Rampage rune on the Aetherwing and get a pretty similar result. Actually, maybe not that similar because it's strength 2, but regardless, Agile rune doesn't really move the needle for me subjectively. So this guy is roughly twice the durability. He's a little bit over twice the damage output, but then he is 3.6 times more expensive than the Aetherwing. So with some models in this game, it seems that they just did not have to pay a price for their movement characteristic and their flying characteristic, such as the Aetherwing. He's priced particularly good, even if he was like a movement 8, no fly. I think 45 points is maybe good for this model. But then things like the Khaine, they seem to have paid such a heavy price for their ability. It just makes it a very difficult thing to recommend to anybody to break. So I will have list choices, and I will have a Khaine in one of the lists, but it will not be any of these troop choices. I just find it difficult to recommend loading up on these. Okay, so that's enough to say about the Khaine. I think I'm done talking about them, period. The Blood Sister versus the Blood Stalker. I like these. They're as much as I can like anything in this faction. This is a tough faction to play, but they're pretty durable. This is pretty nice. 20 wounds at 4 toughness. That's good. Like I said, this extreme range and even the 2 range of the regular melee version, the Blood Sister, is pretty nice. We will examine the difference in those runes when we get. I've tabulated them here in the spreadsheet so we can check on which one to use at what time. Okay, so they are a bit more. They're a better value here with our points per wound and points per effective durability. Not bad. And the Blood Sister comes out to be, he hits pretty good, or I said should say she has pretty good effective damage output, and the points that you pay for that are slightly below average, but not bad. So this is one of the few choices we have in this faction that is across the board not a terrible deal. Everything else is usually, if there's something that's a good deal, then another aspect of it is going to be a really bad deal. So this has notably no red. The Bloodstalker, you can see it's similar durability and price and all that. It does a lot less damage, but you have to remember this is from 20 inches away. So very nice. And once again, do not get into melee with it. It's 1.1 is just not going to do anything. Okay. So I've calculated here the turn to crystal. The average damage output from using the turn to crystal ability is, so if you just, on any dice, any random dice, you would get an average of 0.92 damage. If you said, I'm only going to use turn to crystal on double pairs that are 4 or better, you would get an average of 1.17. And if you said, I'm only going to use this best case scenario on double pairs of 6s, then you get an average damage output of 1.33. Let me take this opportunity, since I'm talking about this ability rune, I'm going to expand my bosses here, just so you can see the Blood Sister Gorgai has that same ability, and since it doesn't perform differently for the boss versus the troop, it actually, in the boss version, I would not recommend using that ability for the boss, because none of these scenarios, even if you only used it on a 6, it does not outperform Onslaught. So what I have here is the Onslaught Delta. So this model is doing 8.18 damage per action. And if you use Onslaught to give yourself an extra attack, you're doing 9.55. average damage per action. The delta between those two is 1.36. So you using the double, if you have a double dice and you use it for onslaught, you get 1.36 extra damage. Whereas if you use it on this this special ability, the TTC, you get best case scenario 1.33 average. So it's just not a good idea to use this on your boss. So I do not like this rune on this boss, but other than that, this boss is very nice. Okay, the Heartseeker's ability. Similar thing here. Let me just hide these since I'm done talking about. I keep forgetting what TTC stands for, even though I literally just came out of my mouth. It's a hard one to remember. The Heartseeker's ability. So this one is it does damage based on the number of criticals. So you can see, and this one always pretty much in every case turns out to be worth it. So it's used from the Crone and the Stalker, so these are our long-range options. And for a double ability, this thing is really, really nice. It's really worth the value. So if you had no control and you just had to use it on any random dice, it would do 1.75 damage. And best case scenario, if you use it on a 6, it would do an average of 3 damage for a double. So that's a pretty good way to spend your double if you have to spend a double. And even on the regular troop versions, they firmly outperform Onslaught. So these are nice doubles abilities. So that gives it. So if you had, just imagine we're taking a turn, we're attacking with Bloodstalker Crone. We hit one. We hit from 20 inches away, we hit somebody for 3.79 damage. Then we hit him again for 3.79 because we didn't need to move because we have this crazy 20-inch range. But then on that second attack, we used Heartseekers and we added 3 to that. So now you've done an average of 9.79 damage from 20 inches away in one turn. So pretty nice feature for this Crone. So even though this is a kind of a low number, and so is from the Bloodstalker, the fact that you can add in this really nicely pointed ability to that range damage, because there's no maximum. I mean, there's So if you hit him with Bloodstalker, you could potentially add on the Heartseekers and have a nice amount of damage output from a really insane distance. Okay. Hide the leaders again, just to make our lives a little bit simpler. I will talk about the Sisters of Slaughter and the Witch Elves a little bit in unison. So it's a little bit, I don't know how worthwhile it is to really fuss over the differences here, because you're going to run into a situation most likely where you pick out your leader, at least the way I build my list. You pick out your leader, you pick out the things that are important, like whatever you think your MVP unit is, which may be something in the elite range, and you say these are going to be kind of the centerpiece, and then you fill out your chaff. And when you're filling out your chaff, these 20 or 10 point differences here aren't going to. It's probably not going to make a difference which of these you choose, because you're going to run into a situation where you probably don't have the number of points left over to have made. You're not going to take if you had to make a choice of I can take 3 of these guys or 3 witch elves. Well, it's there's not enough points. I mean, you're going to leave points on the table if you took the witch elves versus the Sisters of Slaughter with the buckler, because they just don't work out the same. But you didn't have enough points to maybe take 4 witch elves versus the 3 Sisters of Slaughter. So you're probably going to get into a situation where you have a finite number of points at this phase in your list building, and I would say just use them the best you can. But let's look at how they work out anyway. So the Sisters of Slaughter variants have the 2-inch range weapons, but other than that, you have a version with a shield, and the shield version has +1 toughness. And as you know from my other videos, +1 toughness isn't my favorite attribute in the game. And all the ones without the shield, they all get 1 extra attack. So you can imagine how this is going to work out. The things with the extra toughness are going to have a little bit more durability, but the things with the extra attack are probably going to have a significant boost to their damage output. So let's scroll over, because I think the number of attacks is an undervalued stat in this game. So scrolling over. Okay, the only thing that's relatively, not horrifically expensive from a points per wound perspective is the Witch Elf, but everything's a little bit pricey when you actually figure in their low toughness and low wounds. For the point values, nothing's great here. So this is just not a durable faction. If you're expecting to, you're gonna have to have a strategy that's kind of hit and run maybe, or something. Just don't expect to like stand in front of an orc and survive for very long at all. It's just not how it's not how it's going to work. That's why I think, all things being equal, I would probably tend toward the longer range weapons with this faction, because anything at 1 inch is going to be a death sentence for pretty much any model in this faction. So the whip and knife version of the Sisters of Slaughter is notably bad, but like I said, these pairs match each other. So the shield pair is the same Witch Elf versus Sister of Slaughter. It's all the same. The only way that these things differ is just their weapon range and the extra boost in damage output. So for the extra 10 points, the shield version of the Sister of Slaughter over the Witch Elf, for 10 points, you get 0.5 extra damage, and you get 1 inch extra reach. Whether or not that's worth it, it's probably not even going to be an issue in your list. Depending on how many points you have left over, you might not have to make that decision. But probably, I would say probably buy the most expensive ones that you can, without leaving too much points on the table. And same with the Sister of Slaughter versus the Witch Elf with the knives. You get an extra point, what's this, almost 0.7, 0.67 extra damage, and an extra 1 inch point in range. So in general though, I don't think you're probably going to be in your list building here having to make the choice between a lot of these things, the shields versus the double weapons. But I think getting the extra attack, I think this extra amount of damage is worth the sacrifice here. So this going from 5.91 to 7.17 durability, I don't think is going to translate to much real world difference in the game. Like this, if the average attack in the game, it does 4 point something. I can't remember the stat off the top of my head, but if it's a little bit over 4, then these are going to be on average 2 attack actions to kill, regardless. So regardless of whether it was toughness 4, toughness 3, if it's still going to be just 2 attack actions across every enemy. Obviously, it's going to vary if you're up against a faction with a very low strength attack, then having a toughness value higher than them, you're going to get proportionally a better result, but it's situational. I think so. Looking at this across the whole game, you don't get a ton of benefit here for the shield options, and I think the extra damage output that you're buying is in general worth it. Oh, I should say 0.7. So you're going from you're sacrificing 0.71 damage output for just over 1 attacks to kill. And if they were equal, so if these were the same point values here, and you were forced to make that choice, I think I would probably go with the non-shield version, because I think that the math works out better for you. But it just they make it a little easier to make the decision for us, and that the shield version is a little bit more expensive. But then again, this is going to come down to that situation where it depends on what role you're trying to fill in your warband. So if their role is just to take damage and just to tie people up, then sacrificing that extra little bit of durability in those situations for a little bit of damage output might not be a good trade-off. So I don't think there's a bad way, no matter how many points you have, I don't think there's a bad combination here and bad way to spend your chaff points. So this is just not a real contentious part of this faction for me. I think this is kind of the easy part here. So moving on to, I think, my MVP for this faction, I'm going to give it to, so since I've broken this down into sort of 3 categories, I'm going to give it like kind of a categorical MVP, and I'm going to give it to the Blood Sister / Stalker. I like this. If I had to choose one, I guess I would say the Blood Stalker. But nobody's making me choose. I can do whatever I want. So I like this because it still has a great move characteristic. It doesn't have fly, but you don't seem to. It performs well. It's just a safe. The blood variants in this faction are just a safer bet across the board. You can probably build a list out of Khaine and all like witch elves or something, but I think it's going to be very tricky, and I don't conceptually know how that tactically is going to work out too great. And I think this faction is not going to be very easy to play. So going with anything but a healthy number of Blood Sisters or Blood Stalkers is going to make this an exercise in just excruciating tactical fussiness. So I'm going with the Blood Sister / Stalker MVPs with maybe slight nod to the Crones just because their extreme range and their ability I like a little bit better. It adds a very consistent, nice damage bonus, and it's a double. So list building. I'm going to give you 3 list variants, starting with maybe my least favored first and moving toward my most favored. So least favored list, if I absolutely had to take a Khaine, so like if you're out there and you're saying, I really love that move 12 with fly, there's just so many great things I can do. I can zip around the board. If that really appeals to you and you must take it, I'll throw this list idea out, but it's not my preferred list. But I would say I would take the Khaine Heartrender Shrike. I guess that's how it's pronounced, Shrike, whatever. And I would take 2 Blood Sisters. I would take 1 Blood Stalker. And on all my lists, I would, if you're playing this faction, I would just recommend taking at least 1 of the long-range weapon options in your warband. You probably don't want to overdo them because their overall damage output isn't that great, and you do need things that can just absolutely kill, even at close range. So, but the fact that you have something on the board that can hit from that far is going to psychologically make your opponent want to respond to that, because even if you're not doing that much damage, the fact that you are hitting them from so far away will induce a response to some degree. So I think it's a good thing to have tactically, a super long range choice. So moving on to the chaff here would be, I would take 4 witch elves with the knives. Okay, and that should bring, I think that brings you exactly to 1,000 points. So nice not having to leave anything on the table. Next choice, I would take the Bloodstalker Crone, or Crony, whatever. So that's the ranged Bloodstalker leader. I'd take 2 Blood Sisters, and I would take, so this is a bit of a chaff heavy, or not, I don't know, it's a little bit pricey chaff, but this is more small troop options in this list. 4 Sisters of Slaughter with whip and knife, and 2 witch elves with the knives. So that's going to be, so there's no Actually, in all three of these lists, I'm not taking anything with the shields, but you could, if you had the extra 10 points left over, you could take a shield. But anytime I ran into those situations where I had the 10 points left over, I seem to have just moved it around in one of my elite or leader choices. So it's always the little guys getting the short end of the stick here. And my third list would be the Blood Sister Gorgi, 2 Blood Sisters, 1 Blood Stalker, and 4 Witch Elves with knives. So I like this list. You have the long range option with the Blood Stalker. So he's not going to be doing a ton of damage from range, but I think just having him there doing some damage and potentially getting in some big damage turns if you choose to use his ability would be interesting. But then the Blood Sister Gorgi is the hardest hitting unit in this faction. Really the only thing in this faction that does really scary amounts of damage. And 2 Blood Sisters I think are the best overall buy here, just from they do a decent amount of damage. They're not terrible ways to spend your points for durability and for damage output, and they have 2-inch range. It's just not a problem, the 2 Blood Sisters. So yeah, and then with the points I had left over, just dumped them all into Witch Elves and forget about it. If you wanted to, well, you don't have. I think this also hit 1,000 even as well, or maybe 995. So you didn't have any. This doesn't leave any option to upgrade one of those to something other than a Witch Elf with knives. But I like the Witch Elf with knives perfectly fine. So all right, so that's all I have to say about this faction. That being said, if somebody wins a GT event of Warcry, if there is such a thing coming in the future with this faction as it currently stands, I think I would be a little bit surprised. It just doesn't feel for me like a top tier faction. I don't see the tools here for that in the spreadsheet. But maybe the spreadsheets don't tell the whole story. But the things that this faction does that are unique and out of the bounds of the norm, I think there's other factions that maybe do that better and have other solid tools to build upon. So really, really tough faction. If you're playing them, I think it's for the love of the game and for the love of the Snake Elves. But the best of luck to you. And thanks for watching, and see you next time.